Besides the stew over plagiarism, Martha found herself in the soup when readers discovered that a number of recipes in entertaining simply didn't work. The Times food editor, Marion Burroughs, came in low and hit hard. A recipe for tomato fettuccine with snow peas Alfredo, a strange combination, calls for 4 pounds of pasta and about 3.5 cups of sauce. Instructions for preparing tortellini, broccoli, and pesto call for 8 pounds of tortellini, 3 bunches of broccoli, and 2 cups of sauce. The result in both cases is, as might be expected, pasta that is virtually unsauced. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. Today we're reading about Martha Stewart. So last time we were together, she had just launched her book entitled Entertaining, and that's the book that made Martha Stewart a household name. Now, of course, as we know, Martha's been very busy all of this time. She didn't suddenly just come up with this book idea and then be famous. She has been involved in tons of lifestyle magazines. She's got her catering business. She's super hands-on at her house, in the garden, DIYing everything in her house. I mean, she's just super, super busy person, right? But now we finally know about Martha Stewart. Now, I think if you'd been in the right circles, Martha Stewart's name would have been a known name to you, because up until this point, she's had her name dropped at the New York Times multiple times. She, like I said, is involved in a lot of the popular lifestyle magazines at the time. So if you cared about the details of who's behind what, you might have heard about her before, but she's not a household name until this. However, as we read about last time, the book is not without its drama. We learned about how she used her friend who used to work for the New Yorker, and she reeled her in and she said, "I want you to write this book for me," but then she wasn't willing to give that girl her due. And we discussed last time about how it is a little bit of a complicated situation because tons of books have ghostwriters. And most of the time, the ghostwriter doesn't expect to have their name on the cover or to be receiving credit publicly for that. Now, I think that Martha gave her a really ratty deal, monetarily. But I do think the fact that the girl thought her name would be on the book is a little bit interesting. I just think that it had not been made clear to her, or maybe she just didn't want it to have been made clear to her, that she was not an equal with Martha in this whole process. I feel like the fact that Martha cut her out financially, and she knew that before she even went into the book, should have been indication enough that Martha wasn't going to do her the honor of then giving her a space on the front cover of that book. But regardless, Martha and Andy screwed Liz Hawes over real good, and they knew what they were doing. And as she said herself, she was incredibly naive about the process, and she really thought that Martha was enough of her friend that in the end, it would all come out in the wash. Everything would be fine in the end. And I think she had just no idea that Martha was as maniacal, and Andy too, because Andy doesn't get a pass here either. Andy has helped Martha screw over multiple ones of her friends when it came to the publishing world. Andy so often gets a pass for the things that he does that are not acceptable, that are quite manipulative, just because Martha on her every day is such an unpleasant person. But when it came to business, Andy was not above screwing you over and making sure that, you didn't get the financial deal that he and Martha were getting. Okay, so that's where we left off. Let's continue on, though, because there's more drama related to that book. It's not just the writer that they screwed over, but the way they collected material for that book was nefarious, and now people are coming out saying, "Hey, you plagiarist, what the hell is my recipe doing in your book? It's not your recipe, it's mine." All right, this chapter is entitled Stop Thief. A born saleswoman, Martha hit the road to pitch Entertaining, determined to make it a bestseller. For a month, she spearheaded a publicity blitz that took her from coast to coast, border to border, giving interviews, cooking demonstrations, autographs, and winning legions of loyal followers, the charter members of what became an enormous cult of Martha Stewart worshippers and wannabes. But her book and her philosophy also infuriated others, many of them feminists, who thought she was turning back the clock on the many advances made by women by telling them to return to the kitchen. They became charter members and an enormous cult of Martha Stewart detractors. Eventually, Martha became one of those celebrities who people loved to hate. Not that anybody cares what my opinion is, but I don't think Martha Stewart was turning back any clock. I think she was just telling you that there's a way to make your life in the kitchen a pleasurable one, in that you're making your life a beautiful one. If you don't want to be in the kitchen, don't be in the kitchen. Just because Martha Stewart likes to be in the kitchen, that's not an indictment on what you need to do. And people need to quit this business where when they hear criticism that doesn't jive with the way they want to live their life, they take it as some kind of insult on them, that someone's attacking the way they want to live their life. No one's attacking you. You do you. If Martha Stewart wants to wrap a turkey in puff pastry, and instead of just the traditional roasted bird, and that looks ridiculous and stupid to you, because it is, then just don't make the puff pastry wrapped turkey. You don't have to. And if Martha wants to encourage women who enjoy that kind of thing to do it even better, okay. That's a dumb criticism of Martha Stewart. In Los Angeles, she made a hysterically funny appearance on Merv Griffin's nationally syndicated talk show when she locked claws with the South American Spitfire Charo. Earlier in the green room, the two women had gotten off to a bad start, and by the time both appeared on camera, they were hissing at each other. Looking like a pilgrim in a Laura Ashley dress buttoned to her throat, "That's what my public expects me to wear," she once told a colleague. Martha asked Charo, wrapped in something skin-tight and revealing, to help her make hors d'oeuvres. The mischievous Griffin, convinced that the wild singer-dancer didn't like Martha's lofty manners, waited for the fireworks with a straight face. As Martha was demonstrating how Boursin cheese stuffed into snow peas could make a delightful dish, the last of Xavier Cugat's 5 wives suddenly blurted, "But dear, your food gives me gas. I'm not coming to your party." Taking Charo seriously, Martha wagged her finger at the butt-wiggling Vegas cutie, proclaiming, "Well, you'd never be invited. Here, Charo, stuff a snow pea." Griffin, standing between the two women like a referee, said, "Ladies, ladies." Watching at home, friends of Martha chuckled at her performance. It was so funny. Charo made mincemeat out of Martha, recalled Sandy Boyard. Nevertheless, Martha ate up the publicity, good or bad. As far as she was concerned, some of those Merv Griffin viewers were going to go out and buy entertaining, and that was all that mattered. As one friend noted, Martha's underlying philosophy has always been, who cares what people think? On the road promoting entertaining and her subsequent books, Martha quickly gained a reputation as a shrew among the media escorts assigned to take her to bookstore signings and TV and radio appearances. "She's a real screamer," asserted a West Coast book publicist. "Martha will yell at anyone. The limo driver, her staff, anything you do, it's never good enough for her. She wants bookstore displays rearranged at the last minute. The signs are never big enough for her, and then she's ready to skip out before she's finished autographing books." Such an incident occurred in Buffalo, New York in 1996 and received wide press coverage. She pretends she's taking a bathroom break, but she's out the door, and furious women are left standing around with unsigned books, and Martha goes, "Oh, who cares?" I never heard her say thank you, and she never gives anyone credit. She takes all the credit herself. "Oh, it worked out well," she'll say. "Wasn't that a good idea of mine?" As a result, Martha eventually was given the Book Escort's Golden Dartboard Award, a secret dishonor bestowed among the agreed-upon biggest asshole of the year, according to one account. Liz Hawes, who had already been knocked to the mat by Martha over the money and byline issues, was in for yet another low blow to her bruised ego. When a book party was thrown for entertaining at the remarkable bookstore in Westport, Martha basked in the spotlight, but didn't invite the writer. It's right there in her hometown. Somebody mentioned the party to me. I didn't know anything about it, Hawes said. I was stunned. This was my hometown, and it was Connecticut, where many of my writer friends live. A friend who knew the bookstore owner called her and said, "Do you realize what Martha Stewart's done? Do you know there's a co-author?" The owner called me and apologized and said she just didn't realize. 5 years earlier, Martha's one-time cooking partner, Ann Brody, had moved to Washington, D.C., where she went to work as an executive with Giant Food, a supermarket chain. By the time Entertaining was published, Brody had made a name for herself as an innovator. She developed the concept of a gourmet supermarket for Giant and was in the process of opening the first store in the affluent Washington suburb of McLean, Virginia, near the Hickory Hill estate of Ethel Kennedy. Brody thought that it would be wonderful if Martha would make an appearance to sign books, which would promote Entertaining and Brody's store at the same time. But Martha brushed her off by telling her to call her publisher. "I was sort of dumbfounded because I thought she was a friend," Brody said. She got a similar response when she talked to Martha's publicist, whose first question was, "How many books can you sell?" I said, "I don't know. The store's not open yet." And she said, "Well, Martha has no time for that. When you know how many books you can sell, call me back." Shortly after the store had its grand opening, Brody received an unexpected call from Martha, due in Washington, to hawk Entertaining. She said, "I'd love to see you while I'm here, and I have to go to the store before my TV appearance to get ingredients to demonstrate a recipe. Are you anywhere near there?" And I said, "Martha, that is my store." So this limousine entourage arrived, and Martha hopped out and walked in, and I said, "How are you?" She nodded, looking at the produce section, and said, "What, no flowering kale?" And as she was leaving, she said, "You know, I could have sold a lot of books here. Why didn't you let me know?" I said, "Martha, because I should never have had to make a second call. You know, that's where we differ. I take care of my friends." And that was that. Can you imagine the infuriation of that? I could have sold a lot of books here. Why didn't you call me? I effing did call you, you crazy nut. What are you talking about? Not long after, Martha made a return trip to the nation's capital, once again to plug entertaining and to speak at a benefit luncheon for the Washington Home, a nursing facility and hospice. Not in great demand as a speaker, Martha charged and received thousands of dollars per engagement. Her appearance at the Washington function called Entertaining People had been suggested to the event's chairman by a former Westport friend, Diane Sappenfield, whose husband had become a part owner of the Watergate complex. Martha was great, Sappenfield recalled. She put on a slideshow and told the packed audience how she went to the estate auctions and tag sales, picking up bargain dishes and linens. But when the Martha wannabes went home, the event sponsors were left to deal with their honored guest's bill. They didn't get everything in writing from Martha regarding the cost for her visit. And with Martha, you have to get everything in writing, Sappenfield observed. So when they got Martha's bill, it was more than they anticipated because she added in what she considered her expenses. The limousine and the fancy dinner at Jean Louis in Georgetown, that sort of thing. And because it was a charity event, it left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. They said, "This got way out of control. Why did she do this to us?" Martha was a huge success until they got their bill. On the West Coast, Martha was a guest of honor at a dinner thrown by her publisher and attended by stars of the food world. Sitting at her table was the grand food eminence Craig Claiborne, revered for his books and articles and for his knowledge of the art and enjoyment of cooking. While Martha was honored by his presence, Claiborne had told colleagues that he thought she was a mere amateur, an interloper, and he seriously questioned the origin and ownership of a number of the recipes he saw in her book. When she got home from the trip, Martha confided to Dorian Lee Parker, one of her cooks, how upsetting her confrontation with Claiborne had been. Martha told me that Craig turned to her and said, I have a bone to pick with you, and she said, "Well, what's that?" And Claiborne said, "Well, I'm the only person at this table whose recipes you didn't steal." I must say Martha was very indignant. In her acknowledgments and entertaining, Martha had credited Parker, a former high-fashion model and the sister of cover girl Susie Parker, along with two other valued workers, Brooke Dojny and Charlotte Turgeon, for their help in cooking and testing my recipes. But were they really Martha's, or had they been lifted, as Claiborne had suggested? Very few of the recipes were Martha's, Parker asserted. 1/3 of the recipes were ones that Liz Wheeler, another member of Martha's kitchen staff, and I and other people gave her. From the day that Entertaining was published, allegations of plagiarism stalked and haunted Martha for some years to come. Norma Collier, for one, said she called Martha, after reading Entertaining, to complain that many of her personal recipes and ideas, such as the basket weaving on a wedding cake, which Collier had gotten from a picture in the magazine, had appeared as Martha's own. Andy responded by saying, "Well, you know what, Norma, we checked, and you can't copyright a recipe, and just for insurance we changed 4 tablespoons to 1/4 of a cup or vice versa." They did things very deliberately. In the late 70s, Barbara Tropp, fresh from a graduate program in Chinese studies at Princeton, had written 2 articles for the Cuisinart magazine, The Pleasure of Cooking, that included classic recipes and recipes that were idiosyncratic to Tropp's Chinese cooking mentors. By 1982, Tropp's first book, The Modern Art of Chinese Cooking, was appearing in bookstores across the country, simultaneously with Entertaining. Tropp was close to, or known by, a number of highly respected food writers, including such luminaries as James Beard, Paula Wolford, and Barbara Kafka. One day I got a note from one of my old buddies saying, "Barb, you might be interested in taking a look at this new book called Entertaining. I think the author stole a bunch of your recipes," said Tropp, breaking years of what she termed a no-comment attitude on the subject of Martha Stewart. Leafing through the big, glossy volume, Tropp came to a chapter entitled A Chinese Banquet for 10 to 12, which began, "My daughter Alexis introduced me to the pleasures of preparing Chinese food at home. She loves to browse in old cookbooks and new food magazines, and like many young people is particularly attuned to the fresh combinations of flavors and textures in Chinese food." Then Tropp froze. The recipes she saw were straight out of her published magazine article. "I was shocked because it was just so clearly plagiarism," she asserted. "And what equally shocked me was that it was virtually verbatim. Some of these dishes were names I even had made up. It was so blatant. It was clear to me that Martha Stewart had lifted my work with that attribution." Tropp went home and dashed off an irate note to Martha's publishers. I got a letter back that was a non sequitur. It said something like, "Dear Miss Tropp, we're delighted that you like Martha Stewart's book. We'll send you an advance copy of her second." It angered me, and I called up a bunch of friends to tell them what was going on. I felt very injured and wrote postcards to some of the people in the business who were very influential, people I regarded as my mentors. I explained to each of them what had happened and asked for suggestions about what I should do. And in telling them what Martha had done to me, they told other people. Soon Martha's actions were a cause célèbre in the very insular and often bitchy food world. One of those who heard about the scandal was an old high school friend of Trop's, Richard Sachs, a chef and prolific food writer, who was then writing a book review column for Cuisine. He was, as he acknowledged later, the first to expose Martha Stewart for recipe plagiarism. I had known about what she had done for over a year, but Cuisine didn't want to handle it. They felt it was too hot and too finger-pointing. They finally decided to do something when recipe plagiarism had become a problem in the industry. After Sachs's not nasty but sort of juicy article appeared, Martha telephoned him, and according to Sachs, was very kind of hands-on hip indignant, very kind of high horse. She called me to chew me out. Martha wasn't through. She followed the call with a written point-by-point rebuttal of Sachs's claims. But she never really addressed the issue, he asserted. She came back by saying that there was supposed to be attribution, but never explained why there wasn't. Martha's recipes were verbatim Barbara Trop's. I mean, ingredient by ingredient. She used exact phrases. I checked them side by side in researching my piece. Then Martha set out to prove that terms used by Barbara were not terms that only Barbara knew, but were more widely used. Martha claimed that she had citations from Chinese cookbooks. It was almost like the O.J. Simpson trial. She was fighting on the merits of very small points. It also was shades of how Martha had handled her dispute with the owners of the Market Basket over the word proprietor. Furious at Trop for causing the brouhaha, Martha told the Chicago Sun-Times, "Maybe Barbara Trop is jealous that my book has sold 120,000 copies, and hers has only sold 5,000. The paper checked Martha's assertion with Trop's publisher, who said in fact Trop's book had actually sold 15,000 copies and was in its second printing. Martha saying that about Barbara was one of the least gracious things she could have done, Sachs said. As the scandal escalated, Trop received another letter from Martha's publisher saying that she would receive credit in the next printing. In fact, Martha had changed the Lexi Chinese banquet sentence to read, "With several of the recipes inspired by the Chinese scholar and chef Barbara Trop, Lexi executed her first Chinese banquet at 13 as an anniversary surprise for Andy and me." Chinese scholar Barbara Trop really saw red this time. Those weren't recipes that were inspired by me. They were recipes that were stolen from my writing. It was an affront. It had nothing to do with my career in cooking. It had to do with the realm of writing. This was strictly intellectual. It wasn't economic. In my own book, when I used recipes of other people, I credit them. I don't say it was inspired by them. There's creative plagiarism and there's blatant plagiarism, and this was blatant. Like others who had had their problems with Martha, Trop described herself as a non-aggressive person and decided to drop the issue and move on with her life. I don't like conflict. I don't like to be embroiled. I'm a small, dark-haired Jewish girl, and there's no way I'm going to get embroiled with my psychic opposite. When I meet tall, lanky blondes like Martha Stewart who are into their power, I step aside. Besides having food writing in common, Trop, like Martha, had grown up in New Jersey and graduated from Barnard. Some years after their contretemps had blown over, Trop learned that the now very rich and powerful Martha Stewart was to be appointed to Barnard's Board of Trustees. Now that upset me, Trop declared. I felt that was an affront. I believe that people who serve on the boards of colleges should have honorable professional lives. I learned at Barnard what plagiarism was and how one properly gives attribution. So the fact that someone like Martha Stewart, who flattered what I learned there, would be on Barnard's board struck me as a terrible, terrible affront. Although Trop and others declined to take action, allegations of plagiarism continued to surface, and stories about Martha's questionable methods had begun to spread from food journals into the mainstream press. In its December 1st, 1986 issue, Newsweek, for example, charged that Martha's debt to other cooks seems clear. The Crusty Mustard Chicken in Quick Cook, Martha's second book, appears in Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking, as do the Orange Almond Cake and a sister to the Raisin Cherry Pound Cake in Entertaining. At her November 1986 seminar, Stewart distributed recipes on her letterhead for a sauce and a chocolate jelly roll that came straight from Child and The Joy of Cooking, respectively. Each time a new charge was lodged, Martha asserted that her recipes had been developed over the years in her catering business. "Sweet and hot cabbage pickles and lion's head meatballs are not Barbara Trop's inventions," she said. "They've been around for years, and Julia Child acknowledges that orange almond cake was being made a couple of 100 years before her books were published. Recipes are in the public domain. Some of my recipes have been picked up by others, and I've never complained. I see it as a form of flattery." In fact, recipe ownership is difficult to prove, and cookbook writers often build upon earlier recipes. There's a point well made in the fact that all recipes are sort of in the public domain. I mean, how many different ways are there to make a chocolate cake? But this isn't like Martha just had some Chinese cooking. She stole the recipe point by point, and even some of the titles of some of the recipes were the same as the ones published in the magazine. That can't be anything other than plagiarism. Another of Martha's victims was Richard Jeffrey, a respected still life photographer. Their relationship dated back to 1978, when Jeffrey was assigned to shoot a feature story about Thanksgiving at Turkey Hill for Cuisine. In 1980, around the time Martha began gathering material for entertaining, she asked to borrow Jeffrey's pictures, saying she needed them to make a presentation to a client. He was happy to help her out. Shortly thereafter, Andy retained Jeffrey to work on Glorious Foods, and his impressive work on that book led to a long series of assignments for home entertaining, a special supplement of the New York Times. Because of his busy schedule, Jeffrey forgot about the photographs that he had lent Martha, and a decade passed before they once again came to his attention. In 1990, a cookbook publisher wanted to use one of them, and the editor informed Jeffrey that it had appeared in Entertaining. Jeffrey was puzzled because he didn't recall ever selling photographs to Martha for the book. In fact, he hadn't. She'd just gone ahead and used them without his permission and without compensation, in violation of U.S. copyright law. I telephoned her and confronted her, and she denied doing any of those things, Jeffrey said. She said, "I sent you a copy of the book." And I said, "Oh, come on, Martha, that's not true." And she said, "You signed over the rights to me." And I said, "That wasn't so." She said, "I bought the rights from you." And I said, "If you can send me a copy of a check from you to me with my endorsement, I'll drop the whole thing." And she couldn't. Jeffrey hired an attorney who specialized in copyright infringement. And he began preparing a case against Martha that he intended to file in federal court unless a satisfactory out-of-court settlement could be reached. To avoid a lawsuit, Martha offered Jeffrey $1,000 through a lawyer. Jeffrey felt this was an insult. The offers kept escalating, and finally his attorney saw a settlement in sight. He said, "Why don't we settle for $15,000? I said, "Why don't we try for $20,000? And Martha's side, Random House, which had bought the Crown Publishing Group, agreed. We settled in May 1993, and that was the end of it. But I had to pay half to cover my legal costs. Around the same time, Martha had one of her assistants call Jeffrey requesting to borrow even more pictures. "She's got big balls," he declared later. "Nothing she does shocks me." I cannot even imagine the gall that Martha Stewart had to think that this was an appropriate thing, that she could ask this person of all people for more pictures. What, are they just supposed to forget that they are in a battle with you for the last time you stole from them? Does she think that people are stupid? Yeah, actually she did. She did. She thought everyone was dumb. She thought she was the smartest person in any room and everybody else was just a bunch of nincompoops. This chapter begins all the news that's fit. Besides the stew over plagiarism, Martha found herself in the soup when readers discovered that a number of recipes in Entertaining simply didn't work. And you guys, I've seen people talking in the comments under these videos that many times when they would make Martha Stewart recipes, they didn't work. The phone started ringing off the hook at Turkey Hill. Martha's number was still listed, with complaints from hysterical and irate cooks voicing their displeasure, and poisoned pen letters from outraged Martha wannabes began overflowing her publisher's inbox. We spent a lot of time on the telephone talking to people who would say, "Well, I'm having a dinner party for 23 people and I just made the lemon curry and it didn't work." Of course it didn't. Following the recipe was their first big mistake, said John Hiltz, a bright young graduate of the New York restaurant school who worked in Martha's catering kitchen. "We knew there were some glaring errors in the book, and that blew a lot of people away." Marinda Friedman, who served as executive director of Martha's catering business, Martha Stewart, Inc., during the 2 years following the publication of Entertaining, said, "I'd report the calls to Martha, and her comment was, 'Well, they must be doing something wrong because I know the recipe's right, they just aren't doing it right.' She dismissed the complaints out of hand. She never acknowledged that she might have made a mistake." As far as Martha was concerned, Entertaining was the best cookbook ever produced, despite all the hullabaloo about where and how she got her recipes, and whether or not they worked. From the moment Elizabeth Hawes started writing, Martha predicted it would be a monster bestseller, and she believed book critics would share her view. Many did. Ruth Diebold's comments in Library Journal typified those of many reviewers. She announced that Martha had a fine eye, a sense of theater, and a respect for both physical beauty and the taste of food. Recipes are excellent, well explained, and usually practical, though occasionally flair overcomes common sense. A rich kid book, but never a snobbish one. This is a treat for eye and palate. Publishers Weekly, whose pre-publication reviews are closely watched by other critics and booksellers, gave legs to Entertaining with a rave. One of the most sumptuous books of the season, replete with gorgeous color photos and meticulously detailed recipes, this knockout volume well justifies its price. But Martha's main concern was what the New York Times would say. She even asked Anatole Briard to use his influence to have the review assigned to a friendly critic. He didn't. For Martha, Wednesday, December 15th, 1982, was a day that would live in infamy. The Times food editor, Marion Burroughs, came in low and hit hard, pounding entertaining like a piece of tough veal. While she praised Martha's book for being one of the year's most beautiful, she wrote that it belonged in the living room rather than the kitchen. One would no more dream of cooking from it, splattering it with olive oil as you work, than one would think of thumbing through an expensive art book while eating fried chicken. She said that it was a book for browsing, to glean ideas for table settings or menus, for looking at the beautiful photographs, or for enjoying vicariously what is eaten at parties, when a caterer is in charge. Burroughs observed, quote, Mrs. Stewart is a woman of many talents. She lives and works in a beautiful country house in Connecticut. She is seen throughout the book gardening, beekeeping, picking sunflowers, feeding chickens, cooking, posing with her kitchen staff. She can describe how to put together a party with style, but one is better off not using her recipes, which are fraught with errors. A recipe for tomato fettuccine with snow peas Alfredo, a strange combination, calls for 4 pounds of pasta and about 3.5 cups of sauce. Instructions for preparing tortellini, broccoli, and pesto call for 8 pounds of tortellini, 3 bunches of broccoli, and 2 cups of sauce. The result in both cases is, as might be expected, pasta that is virtually unsauced. A recipe for gingered flank steak sauté calls for 2-pound flank steak and a marinade containing 2 tablespoons of salt and 2 tablespoons of soy sauce. The saltiness makes the dish inedible. The directions say to reserve the marinade to pour over the steak, but there is no marinade left. In several recipes, ingredients are listed out of order, and in one appear to be part of the stuffing, but turn out to be a garnish. Martha was livid. That Berrien Burroughs is a bitch, she declared to her pal, Claire McCulley. McCulley said Martha began making paranoid statements such as, They're after me. They don't want me to be successful, but I'm going to be more successful than all of them put together. I'm going to get them. Martha became defensive that the food people were making light of her because she was just a caterer. She ranted on and on about how hard she'd worked all her life and how she had worked for everything she'd ever gotten. Martha angrily telephoned Burroughs at the Times, the food writer disclosed. She was horrified about my review. She was very upset. She told me that she had told some friends that she was going to call me, and they had told her that she was very courageous. She asked me if I tested the recipes, and when I essentially told her that I had, I personally didn't, but they were tested for me by a tester whom we've used for some 20 years. It was as if she didn't believe me. Burroughs wasn't surprised by Martha's call. We get all kinds of phone calls from people who suggest we've done things we haven't done. I defended myself. Later, someone sent Burroughs a clipping of an interview in another newspaper that quoted Martha suggesting that I had not told the truth, that I had not tested the recipes, but the bottom line to all of this was the recipes that we tested didn't work. Burroughs' review became the talk of the Times, recalled Brian Miller, who had just come aboard as a newspaper's restaurant critic and was a neighbor of Martha's in Westport. It was the first time I'd seen a cookbook really taken to task. There was a big brouhaha about it, and Marion had to defend herself quite vigorously. Anytime there's a backlash from something you write, the Times usually checks with you to make sure that you're on steady ground, and maybe Marion had to go in and back up accusations. 4 days after Burroughs' devastating review, a glowing feature about Martha appeared in the Times Connecticut section. Written by Patricia Brooks, it gushed about Martha's bustling holiday catering business and actually raved about entertaining, which Brooks effusively described as lavishly oversized and full of inviting color plates that show Bosc pears and red wine with crystallized violets crowning the top of each pear. On another page, one sees tomato fettuccine with snow peas that also looks good. It was the same recipe that Brooks' colleague, Marion Burroughs, had sliced and diced a few days earlier as a strange combination. The lengthy feature also showed the smiling author-caterer making up Ralph Lauren Christmas baskets in her Westport kitchen, with one of Nyad Einzel's copper cookie cutters in the foreground. While Martha's publishers were disappointed over the Times' stinging review, everyone was overjoyed by the sales figures. The first printing of 25,000 copies had quickly sold out. As Martha noted, we had to reprint it immediately, so it went up to 50,000. To avoid future problems with defective recipes, Clarkson Potter hired a freelance food editor, Anne de Ravel, to check all of Martha's recipes in her next 2 books, which were already on the burner: Martha Stewart's Quick Cook, set for 1983, and Martha Stewart's Hors d'oeuvres, scheduled for 1984. I was hired right after the whole thing about plagiarism, and the review bureaus did. They felt the recipes needed to be checked, said DeRavel, a former food columnist for the Hartford Courant, who was at the time a food tester for the New York Times, twice yearly entertaining magazine supplement, and was married to Brian Miller. I wasn't testing the recipes, but was checking on the accuracy of the ingredients and making sure that no steps were missing. DeRavel recalled that when she worked on Martha Stewart's hors d'oeuvres, she thought the recipes were very sketchy. I don't think Martha really tested the recipes herself. I had to fill a whole lot of holes because Martha's recipes were not consistent. I warned Carolyn Hart, the editor, that while they might be accurate on paper, they might not be accurate in a kitchen. My impression was that was all fine with Martha. All she cared about was that at the end, everything was done. And it looked good. We have to stop there, my friends. Sorry to say. But this is not the first time I've heard that Martha Stewart's recipes didn't work. The first time I heard that was from you all in the comments, as I stated before. And it kind of reminds me of the story of when she gave that little girl a busted up recipe so that she would fail at her little fledgling catering company back when they were like 11 or 12. Martha hasn't changed since she was 11, which is startling and upsetting. But I feel like this business of her plagiarism and this business of her not really doing her due diligence, isn't that like a classic narcissistic trait where you want to get all the credit, but you don't really care if the work behind the thing was done well? Just so long as people think that you're amazing, that's what you need. You don't need them to be impressed with the work. You need them to be impressed with you. And of course, doing good work will lead to them being impressed with you. So most of the time they'll do right. But stuff like this, like worrying about the way she presented a recipe, whether it was going to work or not, like piddly little details like that, they need not cloud up the environment. Just so that everyone looks at the book and thinks, whoa, this is impressive. That's why the color photographs were such a great idea for her, because she could make such beautiful pictures and people would assume that if she could have created these beautiful pictures, then the recipes must work. And yet, as any of you guys know from food photography, half the time what you're looking at isn't food. It's things that look like food but will hold up better under cameras and lights. So just because the pictures were pretty was no indication that these things were going to work. But the plagiarism too. I mean, another example of her just not really caring about the actual product. Just what could you glean instantly from it to give her credit? That's what she cared about. And of course, she's going to dip all these accusations later because rather than just do the work initially, she's like queen of the excuse making. She will work like an absolute dog to make sure that she's got an excuse for why she sucked in the first place. But maybe just don't suck in the first place. What about that novel concept? All right, well, thanks for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you guys again tomorrow for another installment of the Martha Stewart book. Talk to you later. Bye.